Welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis Studios at the National Press Foundation. Funding for today's webinar on OMB and the federal budget was provided by the David Swit Endowment, Evelyn Y. Davis and the Evelyn Y. Davis Foundation, and the NPF Training Fund. It's produced in collaboration with the Center on Congress at Indiana University and the Regional Reporters Association. And it's coming up right now. The National Press Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping journalists cover complex topics with depth and accuracy. Our mission includes journalists around the U.S. and around the world. Welcome back. I'm Linda Topping-Streitfeld, Director of Programs at the National Press Foundation. Joining me in the Evelyn Y. Davis Studios is Kathleen Peroff, a public and private sector consultant on federal funding issues. She's a 29-year veteran of the Office of Management and Budget, having worked on defense, nuclear security, energy, space, science, housing, and other issues. Kathleen, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
As we look ahead to the release of the President's budget on Monday, journalists in Washington and elsewhere are trying to get their arms around what's happening here. OMB has done a lot of work to prepare the White House proposal. You've got some slides. Can you take us through it?
I'd be happy to. And I'll begin by talking a little bit about the history and overall mission of OMB to provide some context. OMB goes back to 1921 when it was actually called the Bureau of the Budget, and it was located in the Department of the Treasury. It was in 1939 that it was moved to the Executive Office of the President. And then in 1970, it was, as a result of the Ashe Commission, provided additional responsibilities to help the President not only prepare the budget, but also to coordinate executive branch management. And so as a result, it was renamed the Office of Management and Budget. Today, it is the largest component of the executive office of the President, and it is a powerful arm of the presidency, regardless of party, whose work is not very visible, but it is certainly felt in many places. This mission statement provides an overview of the key components of what OMB does, policy, budget, management, and various regulatory review. Over the last few years, Congress has also given OMB additional statutory responsibilities. I can just mention some of them that relate to the Government Performance and Results Act, additional responsibilities related to overseeing procurement, particularly for technology systems, intellectual property, cybersecurity, etc.
A question. OMB is in the executive branch. Is it considered nonpartisan?
That's a very good question. Let me just say that the institution is small. It has less than 500 people. Right now, I think between 450 and 470 individuals, and most of them are civil servants. There is a layer of there are people there who are political appointees, obviously, and the number of those varies, but it's a thin layer for the most part. And so the staff are nonpartisan. The culture emphasis there is neutral competence. And that means that when there's a new administration that comes in, there's a transition period, obviously, because if there's been a change in administration, sometimes there's, at least in the beginning, a little bit of distrust, because these are the same people who have just been working with the previous administration. But normally within 6 months or so, the new appointees learn what the staff are really about, and that is to help the president, whoever that president is, whichever party, and to support the presidency. The staff bring a longitudinal memory. They bring a lot of knowledge about how things work, about the programs, and soon political appointees realize that's of value to them.
Great.
I've started to talk about some of the points that I want to make here about the strengths and challenges of staff at OMB. And as I noted earlier, there's a very strong culture of professionalism, emphasis on neutral competence that focuses on supporting the president regardless of party. And who are the staff? Well, most of them have advanced degrees, like the CBO staff with whom we work closely. Both hard and soft sciences are represented. Interestingly, in my former division, the last division I headed there, which was National Security, I had a chemist, I had a physicist, I've had engineers working for me, I had an astrophysicist. So depending on the programs that examiners have responsibility for, we bring in and try to hire the kind of appropriate staff. But I'd say most of the staff have probably policy degrees or business backgrounds. As I said earlier, the staff is small, and actually it's come down over time, while at the same time OMB has been given more statutory responsibilities. It's because it's small and because of the nature of the work, which is fairly fast-paced. It's a rather horizontal organization. There's not very many layers, 3-4 layers at the most, and things move through that organization fairly quickly if there are issues that have to be taken up the line for decisions. And that's, I think, one of the great appealing factors, at least for me, for working in an organization like that. Rather junior people can have access to the director, and in a major organization like DoD, that wouldn't obviously happen. Over time, there's been an effort to bring more transparency to the public about OMB. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of the kinds of online data sources we have, which I think would be of interest to journalists and other stakeholders.
I'm glad you said that, and I'm going to interrupt for just a minute to make the point that at the end of this slide presentation, there are links to some fantastic resources for journalists, data sets and websites that can be very, very helpful. So whether or not you're able to stay with us for the whole presentation, I encourage you to skip forward to the end in this recorded version and make use of those resources, and thank you for including them.
I think that that development is really rather recent, and I think it's a very welcome one. Excuse me, let me get one of the other points I want to make about improving federal management, and this is a point that I will return to several times, is the challenge therein. We're a small organization. Improving the overall federal management of the vast federal government is obviously not just OMB's responsibility, but all of the federal agencies. Nevertheless, we play a significant role in terms of providing circulars and guidance on a whole variety of issues, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. But one of the things, just as a staff member, I would comment on is that each administration has a different sort of set of issues that they wish to focus on in terms of management, a different approach often. So unfortunately, you don't get the kind of consistency sometimes, at least at the staff level, that we would like in terms of focus. This is the organizational structure of OMB. I want to make just a few key points. Obviously, the Office of the Director is at the top of the organization, and within it, you have your General Counsel, your Office of Legislative Affairs, which is a very key office that manages OMB's relationship with the Hill, and that means certainly managing relationships with the appropriators. It means making sure that the administration gets its views up to the Hill. There's something called Statements of Administration Position, colloquially in OMB referred to as SAPs. And these are documents prepared by OMB staff about where the administration signals its position on bills that are going through Congress, either appropriations bills or authorization bills. And will also signal, not only sort of have comments about some of the substance, but will have a bottom line signal about whether the administration is considering opposing how strongly they oppose the bill or support the bill, or even if they're intending to veto it.
And does the public have, and by the public I mean journalists, have access to the SAPs?
The SAPs generally are placed on the White House OMB web, and I have the reference to that later.
Great.
So yes, you can get that, or you can call the Office of Communications within the Director's office, and they will certainly provide that information if it's not on the web quickly enough. I'm not going to talk about each of these offices in great detail, but the Budget Review Office is a critical office that that has responsibility for pulling together the entire budget, and that is just a really, really, really complex and intense endeavor, especially between September and February, when this office has to manage the process by which we develop the budget, how we interact with the agencies, and once we get all the decisions in, it's that office that pulls together all of the numbers into an enormous database, is responsible for printing the budget. So it's a very, very key office. There's also the Performance and Personnel Management Office that is responsible for some of the management and emphasis on performance. And again, I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. As I indicated earlier, there are also statutory responsibilities that have emerged over time, more than just putting together the budget. One is the Office of Federal Financial Management, the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, the Office of E-Government and Information Technology, and the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. These, and lastly, the Intellectual Property Enforcement Coordinator. So these are offices where Congress has specifically said we care about these functions and we want OMB to have some staff dedicated to these particular functions. So they're obviously related tangentially to the budget, but they're separate offices and they have very separate functions. For instance, the Office of Procurement Policy puts out a lot of guidance to all of the agencies on procurement policy and issues related to contracting versus not contracting, issues related to competition on contracts, and a host of other detailed issues. Then you notice in the chart below the sort of lime green line, it's called Resource Management Offices. There are 5 different divisions there, or offices, and essentially every federal agency and every federal program has someone in those resource management offices who has budgetary policy management responsibility for that, both for the agency and for for a program therein.
This really illustrates what you said earlier about the horizontal structure of OMB. You're covering such a wide range. Every issue, every program that the government funds is stretched out along that bottom line.
Yes.
So for a journalist, if you're interested in a particular program, you can be sure that there's someone in OMB who's got a little bit of a handle on it.
That's correct. I might add, and this is something I forgot to note earlier, OMB generally, in fact the entire time I was there, has a rather strong policy of not giving the budget examiners or making them available easily to journalists,
Right.
As you may have heard. So if you have questions, generally the OMB policy is that you call the Office of Communications, and they will then get the information from the budget examiners and they will communicate it back to the journalists. Sometimes when there is a lot of discussion and follow-up questions, they will have the examiner on the phone with the journalists, but that doesn't happen a lot.
Right.
So there's openness, but there's also, I think, an attempt to, first of all, allow the examiners to do their day-to-day work, and secondly, to preserve the president's discretion in terms of what he or she is going to propose in the budget without, quote unquote, leaking it to journalists.
Yes, we understand.
I'm sure.
There's always a tension
Yes.
between journalists and the White House, and frankly, in this administration, there may be more tension than there has been
Yes.
previously. The Obama administration is known for trying to hold information very closely and use their own resources to reach out, and that's just part of the process.
Yes. So I think, again, I'm not going to go through each one of these offices, but it's the point that you well made. There's someone in those RMOs that has responsibility for each and every program. Now, having said that, the point that you also made, which was it's a small institution, and so if you're talking about the national security apparatus, we can't be as in-depth as we probably would like to be. I mean, if OMB staff had their way, we would probably double our size, but that's we're not supposed to say that, and not politically correct. But I think, given the staffing that we have, it's fairly impressive how much information that the staff have and how knowledgeable they are about some of the history of programs. I want to talk a little bit now about the budget process, because the budget does take up an enormous amount of time and staff work. And what I've done here is to highlight something that's not very clear to many people outside of OMB, and that is that there really are somewhat two different processes for developing the budget with respect to DoD and other agencies. Let me talk about all of the other agencies first. There is a circular called A11, and that is on the website that I will show later, which describes and prescribes guidance, I should say, for federal agencies in terms of what they're supposed to do with respect to their budget. And that might be a very good circular for journalists to look at, because it really gives you an insight into what OMB expects in terms of the development of the budget from the agencies and what they're required to submit. But in September, almost every agency has to submit their full budget request to the Office of Management and Budget, and it's expected to be an official budget request that is approved by the head of the department or the small agency. Then in September and October, OMB budget examiners review these requests, and it's, I might add that it'd probably be more accurate to say a lot of OMB staff, beyond even the budget examiners, review those requests. The management side as well is looking at it. And that process involves then a series of what we call budget hearings with program and usually budget staff from the agencies. The hearings can go on for several weeks, and from that process, budget examiners develop their list of issues, what I'll call policy issues, where they think there's going to be a need for involvement or policy decision by the OMB director on how much resources, how, or whether even to fund a particular program, or whether the budget that's come in has actually funded some high priority initiatives of the president. Up until they get the request from the agency in September, budget examiners are really not involved in the internal discussions of the agencies. For the most part, the agencies view that as their time to develop their options and their requests, and they don't want budget examiners involved, and understandably.
Sure.
The second thing I want to note is that when that budget comes in, for the most part, it's a one-year budget. It doesn't have an out-year program plan. And I'm making that point now because I want to use that as a key difference with DoD. In the case of DoD, we do not get a budget request in September as approved by the Secretary of Defense. Ideally, of course, OMB staff would like that to enhance our ability to really understand and review it. But really, since the beginning of DoD, that hasn't happened. And the reason that, and this is the argument that's succeeded in convincing policy officials, they're too big. They're too big, they're too complex. They can't get their budget done by September. So what has developed in lieu of that is what is referred to as a joint review. And in this case, we do have budget staff participating within DoD during their process, sitting in on the meetings. And they're allowed to signal, as they do, OMB thoughts, positions, concerns during that process. So that's a very, that within OMB there's been a lot of discussion about that, is which is the better way of doing the budget. And there are pros and cons on both sides. The second point about the DoD budget that is different from the non-defense side is that DoD, and it really goes back to Secretary McNamara, puts a great emphasis on program budget systems review, and it does a 5-year program budget plan each year. That becomes the starting point for the successive year. So when they put together a budget, they've got a 5-year, sometimes 6-year plan. And in the budget, we have those figures. Those are whatever is agreed to by OMB is put into the official budget request, so that the out-year numbers have real policy content. Whereas for all of the non-defense agencies, they're really just placeholders.
So it seems if DoD is planning 5 and 6 years out, it seems like each year's individual budget would be easier to do. It seems it's almost set, because last year it was year 2. Now it just becomes year 1 with some tweaking. Doesn't work that way?
Well, it's a good question. You would think that's the case, but it still involves a lot of work, because there's a lot of change. And usually what happens is that the out-year plan tends to be a little optimistic, and the execution in particular programs or issues that have come up during the year mean that we have to tweak things. But it certainly, I think, does make it a little bit easier because you have a good base from which to start.
Is this also related to this idea that weapon systems are developed take more than a year to build, and ships and planes and all that military hardware?
That's exactly right. There's a lot of procurement funding for programs that are spending over multiple years. And it makes a lot of, it's just very prudent to have that kind of planning and to show what your liabilities are when you enter into a contract for a new carrier or the F-35. So from DOD and OMB's perspective, this makes a lot of sense. And some people argue it makes a lot of sense for some of the domestic agencies as well, where, especially where there's a lot of construction and procurement of major items.
Right. And all of this information is available to journalists in the budget. Is that correct?
Yes,
Great.
it is. Either on the OMB website that I'll talk about, or also if you go to agency websites, most agencies these days have their budgets and their what we call congressional budget justifications online. And there you get even more detail on particular programs. So for example, DOD, just go to, I think it's DOD.gov and put in budget or put in CFO and you'll get lots and lots of information.
Right. Terrific.
I want to make a few observations about the budget process beyond just what we've talked about so far. First of all, the budget requests that come over from the agencies are normally focused on what we call the discretionary budget. And what does that mean? That is the budget that is subject to review by the appropriators on a year-by-year basis. That is those are all of those programs where if there's no appropriation bill, there's no funding for those programs unless there's some unobligated balances from previous years where they can continue to spend. And that's roughly $1 trillion or so in the budget. But some of your biggest spending programs, particularly on the domestic side, are called mandatory programs. And that means that they're not subject to that appropriator review each year. And we're talking about the ones you might suspect, Medicare, Social Security, military retirement, veterans disability payments. Those are programs where the spending just continues regardless of appropriation action, because the programs have been authorized in such a way that spending occurs if people apply for benefits and meet their criteria for those benefits. Money then is dispersed by the agencies running those programs. At the same time that there's not an annual review of these programs, it doesn't mean that the budget can't include proposals to modify these programs. And sometimes that happens. Sometimes, I would say usually there are some mandatory proposals in the budget. Sometimes they're really major, sometimes they're not so major. But clearly, if there's going to be any grand bargain at some point for the budget, we would need, at least in the eyes of most people, we would need to have some proposals to impact both the tax revenue side and some of the mandatory programs. But obviously, that's a major political debate that we haven't resolved. So the point here is that the mandatory side of that budget is really going to be impacted by authorization action, and sometimes you hear the term reconciliation bills that will change the way those programs are structured and thus either increase or decrease mandatory spending. And lastly, I want to talk about the economic projections, which are obviously, that's an uncertain endeavor. But those are very important because they will impact the projections of tax revenues and spending, particularly, again, for the mandatory programs. And OMB, working with CEA, the National Economic Council, Treasury economists come up with their economic projections, and that will have an impact on programs like, again, retirement and other social insurance benefit programs that are tied by law to, let's say, consumer price indices. Medicare, Medicaid spending are tied to the price of medical services. Interest on the debt is linked to market interest rates, size of the budget per surplus or deficit. So that's a major part of that federal budget process that occurs, I think, usually beginning, in the later fall. The meetings are occurring between the economists of the agencies or the entities I just talked about. And then when our budget goes up to the Hill, CBO will look at our budget and it comes up with its economic projections. And there's always been a lot of debate about OMB versus CBO economic projections. I would say two things. They're not that far off usually from each other. On the other hand, small differences over time can have a significant impact on some of the deficit calculations. You mentioned useful online information and the desire to provide that kind of information to journalists who may not be aware of it. Again, to make the point, I think OMB has really tried to become more transparent, and this administration, I do have to give them credit in terms of putting more online than perhaps we have in the past. It may not be the kind of information you always want, but some of these tools are fairly helpful, and they may take a little bit of work on the part of journalists to understand them, but I think you can be surprised how much information is there. First of all, whitehouse.gov/OMB. That would be the first place that I would always go to. Pretty soon we will have the fiscal year 16 budget on there. But you've got not only the budget, you have historical budget tables going back a long time. You have fact sheets that are prepared by OMB staff, but they're coordinated with the agencies and White House policy councils. There's going to be, it's the best place to get information on the administration's initiatives, particularly cross-cutting initiatives. And lastly, the budget appendix. The budget appendix probably takes up a lot of time and much of the time of the budget review division that I was talking about earlier. This is the part of the budget that the appropriators really pay attention to because it has a lot of detail that they want to see. It has proposed appropriations language. It explains what we are intending to do with some of the funds we are asking. It contains legislative proposals, either authorizing proposals, or sometimes we'll put in program changes actually in the appropriation language. So there's a lot of information there. It's fairly technical, so sometimes it is not as clear as it could be to people who are not involved in appropriation law.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you about the historical budget tables?
Mm-hmm.
Those are indications of what budgets have been in previous years.
Mm-hmm, but they also have projections in the budget going forward too.
How do we find out how much was actually spent by an agency in a year? Not what they planned to spend, but at the end of the year, is there any kind of accounting? How do we see if they're in the red or in the black in terms of their own budget?
The historical tables will provide you with what we call budget authority, the amount of money that was made available for a particular program, or what we call budget function. The federal government budget is broken up into major functions, like 050 is the defense function. Mm-hmm. And those tables also provide information on what we call outlays. And an outlay is what actually is liquidated, spent. So you can look at both and get a sense of what was actually liquidated in terms of the budget authority. There are also, if you look at the congressional budget justifications, you can get more detail on that. And the mid-session review, I haven't talked about that. That is a report that is required of OMB, and it puts it out usually in the late summer. And that will also provide us a sense of how outlays are matching up with some of the projections. And then it'll usually there's an attempt to explain why there's some differences.
Very useful.
Another website that has been developed really in the last few years is called Performance.gov. That contains information on selected federal agency goals and objectives, as well as key administration initiatives. It also has a program inventory for each federal agency. So if you want to see every single program that an agency is responsible for, you can go to here and see it. And it's actually quite amazing when you look at the number of programs. Yeah. And it sometimes will identify some issues about redundancy, and because you'll see that, for example, you're doing breast cancer research in DOD and you're doing breast cancer research in NIH, and it raises, well, why are you doing it in DOD? And there's some answers to that, but it's this kind of information out there that certainly can raise those sorts of questions. Another website that's very useful is Usaspending.gov. And there you can see spending. This is actually spending, as you were talking about, not just what was appropriated, but spending by year, by agency, by prime awardee, that is the contractor, and location. They also have it if information on money provided in terms of grants, for example, to state and local governments. And actually, it's not really until I left OMB that I started focusing on this website, and I'm impressed by how useful it is and the kinds of analytic tools that are embedded therein. I put together this very quickly just to give you an idea. I wanted to know how, now this isn't, this is how much money has been awarded to the top 10 contractors so far in 2015.
Mm-hmm.
It took me.
It took me. Spending there.
Yes, it took me probably 10 minutes to do this, and that table was just generated by that web site, and you can see obviously defense is a major player here. Sure. Lockheed, Boeing, United Technologies Corporation. But you can also see that health is, this sort of gives you a sense of where the priorities are. Yeah, McKesson, Merck, Pfizer, and then Los Alamos Consolidated Nuclear Security. Those are contractors that are running some of our Department of Energy laboratories. So, I mean, and this is just one small example of what you can get by going on that.
I'm glad you mentioned that USA Spending, because certainly every regional reporter here in Washington is familiar with that. It's a great way to find out what contracts are operative in your state or the region that you are reporting for.
You're absolutely right. Yeah. The website called recovery.gov is more focused. It provides information on the distribution of money from the stimulus bill, the $840 billion stimulus bill during the recession, and then from the Hurricane Sandy Fund. Congress wanted that, and so that was a website that was put up by OMB.
Let me clarify, is there still money being spent, or is this?
Is some of this money, certainly with respect to Hurricane Sandy, is still being outlaid, as we say. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay.
Still being spent, yes. With respect to the stimulus bill, I'm not totally up to the speed on whether there's still some money being spent there. My guess is there is, because some of that was construction funding. The contracts may have been let a long time ago, but there could still be some money that's being spent under those contracts.
Okay.
And then, and that also underscores one of the points that you learn when you're at OMB. It's not always easy to spend money fast.
Right.
If it's salaries, if it's benefits, the money goes out fast. If it's money that's going to construction, procurement, it can take 7, 8, 9 years to spend, and then sometimes it's not actually spent, and those are those unobligated balances.
Right. We all remember the controversy over the search for shovel-ready projects
yes.
when we were trying to spend to stimulate the economy.
And that's exactly right. There's a tension between spending fast, which is what you want to do during a recession, and spending wisely, effectively, or cost effectively. And that's a tension you're always feeling at OMB. But I guess that's the nature of the beast.
Okay.
And then lastly, another website, a more general government website called data.gov, which is not just focused on spending.
Right, but also a great, useful website. Journalists will find, you can talk about it on data.gov, databases that cover so many areas of the government and things that we're reporting on. It's really useful.
Exactly. I went in there just to look at data and pulled up information on the IRS. If you want to look at individual tax revenues by any sort of category, it's all there in a table, and the table comes out for you. You don't have to do much work yourself, so it's quite impressive.
It's like a miracle.
Yes.
It's a great thing.
Well, that's sort of the summary of, brings to an end my summary of OMB. I guess.
So let me ask this. How many government programs are evaluated on a regular basis, and how is that done, and how are those evaluations used to determine future funding?
It's a very good question. First of all, it takes money to evaluate, time to evaluate programs well. So as an OMB staffer, I will give my bias, and as I wish there were more funds and more staff resources focused on evaluation. Having said that, there's a lot of work that goes on. Actually, during the previous administration, OMB developed something called the Program Assessment Rating Tool. Maybe you've heard about it. It was a tool that got a fair amount of attention. Most of the agencies didn't like it. A lot of others, particularly in the academic world, including Harvard, thought it was a very good thing. But this tool was a set of questions getting at the very issue you're talking about. How are programs achieving the mission that they were designed to achieve? What kinds of outputs? What kinds of impacts? And there was a lot of discussion about what the difference is between an output and an impact. And all of the federal programs were evaluated using that tool, and that information was made public. Obviously, the next question then is, well, how is that information used in the budget development process? It is used, however, at the same time, it's one factor. Sometimes when a program is not performing very well, the political decision will be, let's put more money into it to improve it so it does achieve the results, because we want those, it's an important program from an objective perspective. There are times when there will be decreases in funding, if the program isn't, or even, if you look at OMB, they have often put out lists of programs that have been decreased or actually terminated. So it does happen. But at the same time, I guess would emphasize that it's one factor that goes into the process. It's not always the determining factor. I think this administration has taken a slightly different approach from PART, and it gets to the point I think I made earlier. Each administration has a slightly different approach to the way they do program management and performance evaluation. You mentioned evidence-based analysis or initiatives, and that's a very that is a high priority of this administration, and there are funds that have been made available to look at certain programs and to test certain programs and approaches to see how they work. I personally think this is an extremely good way to go, and I hope that we can expand this initiative more in the future and that it stays around and it won't disappear in the next administration. Just the bottom line is, if you don't know how your programs are working, you don't know what you're getting for your money, and I think in this day and age that's just a big issue with the constraint that we have on resources, and especially with the sequester, that's even more the case.
Absolutely. And that's probably a good note for us to close on. I hope that journalists out there are thinking about how programs are evaluated, and when you're taking a look at the budget, look at the programs that are important to your audience and find out how they're working and how they'll be funded in the future. This has been really, really helpful. Thank you so much, Kathleen Peroff. And thanks again to the David Swit Endowment, Evelyn Y. Davis, and the Evelyn Y. Davis Foundation for their help in paying for this program. Like all NPF programs, this webinar is free for journalists. We encourage you to find our homepage at nationalpress.org, sign up for the newsletter, use the donate button, and thank you for joining us in the Evelyn Y. Davis studios at the National Press Foundation, where we are making good journalists better.